if it's a multi-day project, taking away the trash at the end of each day rather than...
Now, Ross Kaminsky on Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
40 years ago this month, there were some things that happened that particularly impacted the city of San Francisco, but the nation as well. And a couple of things that were pretty shocking, one much more than the other. Joining me to talk about them is my friend and American Spectator colleague, Daniel Flynn, who's got a new book out called Cult City: Jim Jones, Harvey Milk, and 10 Days That Shook San Francisco. Everyone should get over to Amazon and buy Cult City. Good morning, Dan. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So what do we need to know? I mean, 40 years ago is it actually doesn't seem that long to me, especially the Jim Jones thing, because I didn't pay as much attention, I suppose, to Harvey Milk, but the Jim Jones story, so shocking. What do we need to know, and how are these stories tied together?
Well, I think with Jonestown, there's been, from the get-go, there was a misinformation campaign, perhaps inadvertently, when, the news hit the United States that all those people had committed suicide. You had the Associated Press saying that it was religious zealots, New York Times saying Jim Jones was a preacher of fundamentalist Christianity. The reality, when I interviewed people who survived Jonestown, several of them told me that they weren't allowed to bring Bibles into Jonestown. And it wasn't until the community ran out of toilet paper that Jim Jones redistributed Bibles and instructed the people how to use them. So there's this myth that the people in People's Temple, that it was, some type of Christian group. It was not. It was an explicitly atheist group. And if anyone, just listening to any of the so-called sermons of Jim Jones, they can discover that. So, a lot of basic facts about Jonestown people don't know, specifically that they died, and you listen to the death tape, they died thinking that they were giving glory to communism, that they were sacrificing their lives so that people might think better of communism. Jim Jones, of course, said that, this was not suicide, this was revolutionary suicide, protesting the inhumane conditions of the world. And that's why those people thought that, that's why they gave their lives. That's why they thought they died.
Wow. There are, I have seen stories that talk about how Jones actually called himself God sometimes. So clearly this guy, I guess it was an offshoot of some kind of Christian church, but certainly wasn't one in how it operated.
What he said was that that socialism was God, and since he was the embodiment of socialism on earth, that made him God. And so it was a very peculiar theology, and certainly not one affiliated with any fundamentalist Christianity. And of course, it just boggles the mind that a group that was using Bibles as toilet paper would be characterized in such a way.
How did he get so many people to follow him? And I guess I got to remember, when and where this happened. Right, I guess a little easier to imagine a bunch of people following a socialist cult leader, in the 1970s than now. But still, it's remarkable, isn't it?
It is. I think the big important takeaway from the book is that before the poor people drank the Kool-Aid in South America, the powerful did in San Francisco. Jim Jones, a lot of people don't realize, but the mayor of San Francisco appointed him to the city's Housing Commission Authority, and he became the chairman of the Housing Commission Authority very quickly, in effect making him the largest landlord in the city of San Francisco. If you think about how he treated his tenants in Jonestown, it's a pretty scary thought. In other words, when we think about, Charlie Manson or Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy or any of these notorious figures that killed people, you don't think of them holding positions of civic responsibility in a major American city.
Mm-hmm.
But San Francisco in the 1970s was such a bizarre and screwed up place that Jim Jones not only, held power there, but, Jerry Brown spoke at People's Temple. Willie Brown compared him to Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. You had Rosalind Carter, when she traveled to San Francisco to campaign for her husband, Jimmy Carter, for president in 1976. Jim Jones introduced her. They ate dinner together. They called each other on the phone. We know this because we have Jim Jones surreptitiously taped the conversation. And she referred him to Jean Carter Stapleton, who was the president's sister, the president's sister, who was involved in the ministry. And so there was a connection there, not just between Jim Jones and some of the local folks, but in a national sense, Jim Jones was very much in with the in crowd as well.
How long was Jonestown down in Guyana going on before the event that made it famous?
They basically they leased the tract of land in late 1973. And for a few years, you had kind of an advance party from People's Temple down there. And the people that I spoke to that were down there in 1974, for instance, they found it to be very idyllic. They thought that what they were doing was quite like the pioneers were doing in the United States. They were building a community out of nothing in the jungle. And it wasn't until 1977 that Jim Jones flees San Francisco. Basically, the world starts coming crashing in on him. There's a lot of negative publicity, and there's some legal problems that he faces. He flees, and then shortly thereafter, you have 1,000 people flee San Francisco in his wake. And once he gets down to Jonestown, the commune starts to look more like a concentration camp. And a number of people that I spoke to, I mean, there's all sorts of issues down there. People didn't eat any meat when they were down here. They were just eating sort of like a flour soup and rice. They were overworked. They were deprived of sleep. A lot of people that I spoke to said that the worst part about Jonestown was the fact that they had these loudspeakers going constantly, well into the morning, with Jim Jones talking for 6 or 8 hours a day. And when he couldn't, when the Pepsi he was drinking couldn't fuel him anymore, he would put on tape recordings of his voice. And so people were constantly hearing Jim Jones barking at them over the loudspeakers of Jonestown.
Wow. My special guest, Daniel Flynn, his book, Cult City. There's just so many things to talk about here, Dan. So what was the immediately precipitating event that caused people to drink the Kool-Aid, a phrase that now lives with us still?
Congressman Leo Ryan went down to Guyana to investigate the conditions in Jonestown. And on November 17th, when he visited that night, it almost, he had faced a really warm reception, and it was almost too warm. And it was like a Potemkin village, I guess, that they were putting on a show for him. And once he started getting, he got a note from someone saying, please get me out of Jonestown. Once that happened, everything went sour. When he returned the next day when he started getting people out the next day, someone attempted to assassinate him with a knife, and the guy ended up stabbing himself rather than Leo Ryan. He gets out of Jonestown with about 15 defectors. And when they get to the airstrip outside of Jonestown, Jones sends his security force, a group called the Red Brigade, to kill him. And they kill Congressman Leo Ryan, they kill 3 journalists, and they kill one of the defectors. And at that point, Jim Jones informs his flock they all have to kill themselves. And he has this plan called Revolutionary Suicide, which is a name that he got from a book by Huey Newton, who had written a book a few years earlier. That book wasn't well received. People thought that the title and the concept was idiotic, but Jones really, thought it was brilliant. Met with Huey Newton in Cuba to talk about it in 1977, and he unleashed this idea, thinking that they were going to do something noble, and it was going to be so big it would go down in history. It obviously went down in history, just not the way that he imagined it.
I mean, do you know anything about what he said to the people who were there to get them to agree to kill themselves?
He taped it, so you have the 45 minutes or so on tape. But I think more important than that is that you have, in 1975, he started drilling people on suicide. He served members of his planning commission wine. and said, look, within 45 minutes, you're all going to die. And one of the ladies there started freaking out, and at least apparently people thought that Jones sent someone and shot her. And really what happened is it was just staged, that the lady was part of the act. I spoke to a couple people at that meeting, and one of them to this day thought that woman, that she legitimately was freaking out and all this legitimately happened. But in reality, Jones was sort of conditioning them. They didn't die, obviously, even though he told them they were going to die. And the one person who strenuously objected was shot, or at least they thought that. So this went on for a few years, and in Jonestown they had something called White Nights, where Jones pretended that the community was under siege, that they were going to be invaded by these sort of mysterious forces lurking outside of the perimeter. And these White Nights would sometimes go on for days and days and days, and people just wanted them to end. So on November 18th, 1978, a lot of people just they wanted it to end. They didn't have any will to live. But to answer your question, the tape of the death tape of Jonestown, it's very haunting. And Jones is basically saying, look, this is no way for communists to die. We need to die with some dignity. He encourages them to, basically says that they're stepping over into another plane. They're all going to reincarnate. There's one person, one adult who objects. And her alternative is, instead of all of us killing ourselves, why don't we all just migrate en masse to the Soviet Union? Such were the choices in Jonestown. Either A, let's all kill ourselves, or B, go to the Soviet Union. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. Even the dissent, which, in a lot of ways was logical and courageous, the dissent was sort of a captive of that time and place as well.
Wow. So you're talking two days ago was the 40th anniversary of this. I mean, your book is very timely. We're talking with Dan Flynn, his new book, Cult City, Jim Jones, Harvey Milk, and 10 Days That Shook San Francisco. Let's talk about the other character in your book, Harvey Milk, who probably many Americans know only from the movie with what's-his-face. So tell us what we need to know about Harvey Milk, and also tell us what people think they know about Harvey Milk that isn't in fact true.
Sure. Harvey Milk was a politician who ran, almost every year in San Francisco, ran 4 times for office. He really doesn't go anywhere until he meets Jim Jones. And Jim Jones gives him a printing press, gives him publicity from his pulpit, gives him a publicity through his newspaper, People's Forum, which is pretty widely distributed in the Bay Area at the time. And most importantly, he gives him hundreds of campaign volunteers, just sort of at the snap of a finger. And, of course, I use the word volunteer. They're really conscripted volunteers, if such a thing exists. And Harvey Milk, in turn, gives him legitimacy, gives him, I think, something far more valuable. So when the world starts kind of closing in on Jones in 1977, Harvey Milk goes into overdrive and starts contacting various world leaders on Jones's behalf. He writes the President of the United States. There's a custody dispute. Jones had kidnapped a 6-year-old boy, brought him to Guyana, and his parents wanted him back in the United States. And so Milk writes the president, essentially taking the side of the kidnapper, saying that Jones was a man of the highest character, that the boy's mother was a blackmailer and his father was a bold-faced liar. He writes the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Joseph Califano, that Jonestown was a beautiful retirement community that people would pay thousands of dollars to be a part of, that it was helping to stop crime, that it was alleviating the world's food crisis, despite the fact that they were starving down there and people were, they had to import food into the very end, even though it was an agricultural commune. So in other words, he was basically propagandizing on Jones's behalf to Forbes Burnham, the prime minister of Guyana, and to others. And so if you were in Guyana and you're receiving these letters from Willie Brown and from Harvey Milk, and the lieutenant governor of California comes down to Jonestown with Jim Jones, and he says that he's tremendously impressed by what he sees at Jonestown. So you have all this, famous and powerful people in the United States saying what a great guy Jim Jones is. When you're weighing that with reports from Joe Nobody about Jim Jones running a concentration camp, who do you think you're going to believe? And so I think what he did was, terribly cynical, but it was also terribly consequential. because the 6-year-old boy that he told Carter not to intervene in the custody dispute despite a court order in California, he dies in Jonestown. So that, to me, that's the most important part of Harvey Milk's political career. It happens to be the part that's not mentioned in the movie Milk, the 80s documentary that also won an Oscar about Harvey Milk, at the San Francisco airport where they're naming the Terminal 1 in honor of Harvey Milk. That doesn't come up. But that, in Harvey Milk's very short career, that's the biggest thing that happened. That's the most consequential thing.
And you also point out that people misunderstand the motivation of the man who killed Harvey Milk, perhaps intentionally so, in order to try to, say something bad about the political right. If you want to comment on that, I got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, I interviewed Dan White's campaign manager's chief of staff. He's gay, and he says that White knew he was gay, and the idea that White killed Harvey Milk because he was gay is just silly. Dan White was a San Francisco Democrat who was a protege of Dianne Feinstein. He supported gun control. He voted for tax increases. He supported affirmative action. And yet, when he killed Harvey Milk, suddenly the chant became Dan White, hitman for the new right. Dan White attended the largest fundraiser for gay rights in the history of the United States up until that point. The idea that he killed Harvey Milk because he was gay, it doesn't really mesh with the facts. It's a very convenient narrative, and so we get this retelling, years later that Milk is somehow a martyr for gay rights, when his killer, was basically a San Francisco Democrat just like him.
Our very special guest, Dan Flynn, his new book, Cult City, Jim Jones, Harvey Milk, and 10 Days That Shook San Francisco. We'll have this interview and a link to the book up on the blog in a few minutes. Dan, thanks so much for being here, and thanks for writing such a fascinating book.
Outstanding. I appreciate it.
All right. We'll be right back.
This report is sponsored by Staples.
Crowded highways had you head out this morning. Southbound 225, jammed up into the tech center, running slow. Stop and go from Isla on down. That's getting better. There was a stall southbound 225 near Yosemite. That's gone. All lanes have opened. 270, Commerce City Drive, busy. I-70, jammed up eastbound 70 from Federal to Brighton Boulevard. No problems continuing out to DIA. Sunshine factor along 6th Avenue. Watch for a bicycle accident, Colfax and Sheridan. Denver's forecast, sunny skies today, high near 55. Tonight, low at 28. Even warmer tomorrow, high near 60 degrees. Right now, it is 28. With traffic and weather, I'm Susan Thielen, 630 KHOW.
Staples celebrates Black Friday by giving you 50% off Staples gaming chairs, great for work or play. Plus, hot holiday tech like laptops, tablets, and other gifts in stock and priced low. See what's in store this holiday at your local Staples. Chair offer ends 11/26 while supplies last.
So a few minutes ago, I mentioned to you DMD Windows. It's just one example of a kind of home remodeling project that you might do to make your home a place that you enjoy living in more, a place that's more comfortable, a place that's better looking. Maybe you got ugly windows, maybe you got ugly doors, you go to DMD, you get it fixed. Maybe you're doing other things, right, for your home, a roof or finishing a basement, whatever it might be, and you're just asking yourself, how can I pay for this? And you're thinking, well, I could put it on a credit card, but you don't want to do that. Because even if you have an introductory low interest rate, that's going to go away, and then you are going to be paying through the nose. So one thing you can do is work with American Financing and access the equity in your home with a cash-out refi or perhaps even a second mortgage. Talk with them about that as well. And you use the value in your home and put it back into your home. It's like taking money out of your left pocket, putting it back into your right pocket.